Welcome back. It's time to begin the 15th lecture in this Israel in Prophecy series. What I mentioned at the end of last session, we'll go ahead and get directly into. I want to talk a bit about the somewhat subjective and fairly tricky business, the issue of, well, for lack of a better name, tribal identities. This all, by the way, will fall within the general umbrella of migrations of the tribes. But I'm going to take some time and get into some of the historical material that we will also expand on a lot of the history in part 2. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific tribal identities, not so much about Ephraim and Manasseh, although that will come toward the end of this unit. But we'll zero in more particularly over some of the peripheral tribes in as much as the ones who did not receive the double portion of the birthright. Now, before we launch into that material, let me just simply ask you to take a look at your workbook. At this point, you should have been given on the lectures thus far material to answer questions 1 through 10 and questions 14 through 18. Then, in what we look at today, questions 11, 12, and 13. Those will be questions that today and then the next lecture, or maybe even one beyond that, will provide information to respond to those particular ones. Tribal identities. How can we tell? How can we know? Well, it's like, as I've said on other occasions in the series, what convinces one person may not necessarily convince another. As you have no doubt gathered, if you've made it this far in the lecture series, I come at the material oftentimes as a historian would approach it. And to me, one of the best evidences, at least in my judgment, is the pattern and the timing for certain events in the history of Western society unfolding in the way that they have. It is not so much Scripture, I suppose, that validates as when we look and see the unfolding of the pattern, particularly in light of the whole thing that would have been at issue as you move gradually but yet inexorably and at an accelerating rate as you move into from the 17th on into the 18th and late 18th centuries to the 19th century. And the time for the receipt of that double portion of the birthright blessing begins to overtake the people, the descendants of Joseph, to whom that birthright was intended to go. Actually, from even as early as around the 17th century in Western European history in general, not just Western European history, there's a shift that's very pronounced, and most Western civilization textbooks will mention this. There's a shift in the power axis, which runs along an east-west Mediterranean, Spanish, Austrian, Habsburg family-dominated kind of an axis. And that begins to turn. And by the time you get into the late 17th and on well into the 18th century to be sure, you have that axis now running north and south, and it's dominated primarily and interestingly by the French, by the Dutch, by the Swedes, and by the British, each one playing their respective roles in fulfilling this. The question to me, which comes again out of my historical training and background, but is prompted by the issues that we need to answer relevant to the prophecies about Israel. Were the bids made by the French, by the Dutch, by the Swedes, and ultimately by the ones who won, the English, were they bids by essentially Israelitish powers, brothers who were unwittingly preparing themselves to be in the best possible locations, to have the greatest possible advantage, to reap the benefit of the inheritance of a grand, an untold of birthright and inheritance and blessing? Maybe put a different way, are we looking at a sibling rivalry writ large as the expiration of the withholding of that birthright, a 2,520-year withholding of the birthright blessing coming through the Abrahamic promise? Are we looking at a sibling rivalry on a macrocosmic level? This view, at least to me, certainly makes great sense out of the way in which early modern European history evolved. It's worthwhile taking a look at one of the quotes out of the books that I've given you assigned reading to do in, Mr. Herbert Armstrong's United States and Britain in Prophecy. On page 13, at least the text that I'm quoting from. Actually, this comes from the 1986 version, pages 104, 105, 152, and 153, bringing together the general subjects under the same heading in one quotation. But what about the other tribes of the so-called lost 10 tribes? The other 8 tribes of Israel, by that he means excluding Judah, Joseph, Levi, and Benjamin, were also God's chosen people. They too have been blessed with a good measure of material prosperity. Now, if you traveled in Europe, especially in these particular countries, the countries of the northwestern areas, you know that indeed to be the case, especially if you traveled outside of Europe and some of the less developed countries of the world. They received a good measure of material prosperity, but not the dominance of the birthright. These countries of Europe are prosperous compared to the teeming illiterate masses of the world. Suffice it to say here that there is evidence that these other 8 tribes, along with elements of the tribe of Benjamin, which were swept up in the Assyrian conquest of most of the biblical land of Israel, have descended into such northwestern European nations as Holland, Belgium, Denmark, Iceland, northern France, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. The political boundaries of Europe as they exist today do not necessarily show the lines of division between descendants of these original Israelite tribes. Now, that's a fascinating insight. And once again, to put a caveat out and to forewarn you, the material that I'm about to go through, there may not be universal agreement within the community of British Israelites about which tribe should be placed where in terms of the tribal identity. The issue of Ephraim and Manasseh, the descendants of Joseph, that one is a little more readily discerned, I think, than perhaps some of the others. Probably next on the list of high probabilities, and I'll spend a good bit of time in part 2 of the series, delving into looking at and examining the relationship between the French and the English. The French, as was suggested here, very likely spring out of Israelite origins and most probably from the tribe of Reuben. Genesis 35 and verse 2. We've looked in past lectures at some of the issues relevant to Reuben and his rather unfortunate and unique story. But in Genesis 35 and verse 22, we find it came to pass when Israel dwelled in the land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Now, that resulted in the forfeiture of the double portion of the birthright by right of primogeniture, which was to come upon or be given to Reuben. In Genesis 48, if you'll go forward to Genesis 48 and we'll look at verse 5, the famous passage describing the crossed arms of Jacob, laying hands upon the heads of Ephraim and Manasseh. When this event occurred, these words are spoken by Jacob, the aged patriarch. Now the 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto you in the land of Egypt, before I came unto you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they are mine, implying a replacement, that now the tribe of Joseph would take the place and stand, as it says in 1 Chronicles 5 and verse 2, stand in place to inherit the birthright, that double portion of the blessing due to come to the descendants of Abraham through Jacob's children. Genesis 48 and verse 22, describing the blessing being given to Joseph and his offspring. Let's actually begin in verse 21. And Israel said unto Joseph, Behold, I die, but God shall be with you, and bring you again unto the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brethren. Now, we can find more in terms of that right of primogeniture principle in Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning in verse 15. If a man has two wives, one beloved and the other hated, and they have borne him children, and the beloved, both the beloved and the hated, if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, when he makes his sons to inherit that which he has, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. He shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him what? That right of primogeniture, the double portion of all that he has. For he is the beginning of his strength, and the right of the firstborn is his. Ezekiel 47. One more among other scriptures that we could examine. Ezekiel 47 and verse 13. Thus says the eternal God, this shall be the border whereby you shall inherit the land according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph shall have 2 portions, implying that, again, that double portion. Now, what I propose here is that the Anglo-French rivalry, which extends through the length and breadth of Western civilization and its history, that rivalry reached a high pitch, a crescendo, at precisely the time when we would expect it to if Jacob's 2 firstborn sons were about the business of positioning themselves for this titanic struggle over resources, land, a population, and all the things entailed in the birthright blessing. Genesis 25, by the way, is not a bad scripture to bring in at this point. It doesn't apply specifically to Reuben and Joseph, but in principle it certainly does. In the account that we read about the birth of Jacob and Esau, there's a telltale reference here. Rebekah conceived, and it says the children struggled together within her, implying something a little more than just what claustrophobic conditions within the womb. Rather, it implies that there's going to be a wrestling match over who's going to latch on in the long run to the bigger portions of the blessing, to the substantive inheritance. It's a description of the nature of the relationship among Abraham's descendants. Now, in this, Reuben is in an unusually unique role, because as the firstborn of his father, we find that he bore within himself, in spite of his chafing under the preferential treatment given to Jacob's favorite son, the youngest, Joseph. In spite of that, we find that Reuben felt an intense sense of responsibility as the firstborn to prevent bad things from happening to the brothers. The climactic account, of course, here comes when Reuben, far from consenting to the death of Joseph at the hands of his brothers, in spite of the fact that he had the jealousies and the resentments of the brothers as well, he tried to do what he could to prevent and to forestall what was about to happen, a family tragedy by any measure. If you'll take a look at Genesis chapter 37, where some of these parts of the story begin to come out, in verse 2, we'll read an extended passage here that catches the spirit of the story. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years old. He fed the flocks with his brothers. The lad was with the sons of Bilhah, again going back to some of what we've talked about earlier, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father an evil report. He was a tattletale. He came home and told about what his brothers did that Jacob might not be happy with. And Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children. A warning there about the way parents should treat their children. Why? Because he was the son of his old age, and he made for him a coat of many colors, a special coat. And as is often the case in family settings, the brothers were quick, the siblings were quick to pick up on that. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brethren, they hated him, and they couldn't speak peaceably unto him. To make matters worse, Joseph began dreaming dreams, and he told his brothers, and they hated him, as it says in verse 5, all the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaf stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said unto him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Because that was the implication prophetically. Indeed they would, or Joseph would. And they literally would bow down when they came with hat in hand before the prime minister of Egypt, Joseph, by any other name, asking for the grain that would sustain them in life through the famine. Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it to his brethren. And behold, he said, I have dreamed a dream more. And the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me, an obvious implication, to his whole family, bowing down before him, the 11 stars being his brothers, the sun his father, the moon his mother. And he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him, in spite of the fact he was a preferred son. And he said unto him, What is this dream that you dream? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow down ourselves before you to the earth? In verse 11, his brothers envied him, but his father made note of the saying. He remembered it. He realized there was something more there than met the eye, much like Mary made note of the things that the angel told her about what the life of Jesus would be like and what his mission and purpose would be. Now, dropping down to verse 21, when the brothers, Jacob had sent Joseph to find his brothers tending the flocks and herds in the field, when he came upon them, the brothers decided to either kill him, or eventually they made a decision to sell him. Reuben heard of it, verse 21, and Reuben delivered him out of their hand and said, Let's not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, Don't shed blood. Cast him instead into this pit that's in the wilderness. Don't lay a hand upon him, that he might rid him out of our hands, and deliver him, that he, Reuben, might rid the hostile brothers out of their hands, and then deliver him back unto the father again. Now, Reuben left the scene, and in the interim, Midianite traders and Ishmaelites came by, and the other brothers retrieved him from the pit and sold him. And when Reuben returned, verse 29, and Reuben came back into the pit, and behold, Joseph was not there. And he rent his clothes, an expression of intense grief and displeasure. And he returned unto his brothers and said, The child is not. What am I going to do? He was responsible as the older brother for the protection and welfare of all the rest. His ultimate aim was to save Joseph. And indeed, in Genesis 42, when the brothers stood quite uncomfortably in their audience with the Egyptian prime minister, Reuben was quick to remind the brothers of their misdeeds and the fact that he wanted to save the situation, but he could not. And he implies in verse 21 and verse 22 that their misfortune now is the outgrowth, the upshot, the product of their misconduct way back 22 years before. Verse 22, and they said to one another, We're truly guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear, therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answers them, saying, Didn't I tell you that when you first made this mistake? Spoke I not unto you, saying, Do not sin against the child? And he would not hear, or you would not hear. Therefore, behold, his blood is now required on us. Now, I would submit that what we see here is the playing out of a remarkable prophetic development on a grand and large scale. You find this, for lack of a better description, what I'll call Reubenite ambivalence. No, there's not a love for brother Joseph. He was an obnoxious child. He was a preferred child within the family, given treatment that the other brothers didn't receive. How would we expect Reuben or any of the others to look at him in a positive light because of that? But yet at the same time, Reuben's responsible nature, his sense of needing to protect, it comes into play writ large in the sense of Reubenite ambivalence. And the history of the Anglo-French peoples tell an interesting tale in that regard. With one hand, it seems that the nation-state of France tries to strike a blow against either the Americans or the British. And almost simultaneous with the other hand, they offer something of benefit. The American Revolution is a case in point. What we oftentimes, those of us who live in America, tend to forget, we lose sight of, is that the French assistance in terms of financial and material and human support was enormous and did a great deal in helping the Americans ultimately win the war. Names such as the Marquis de Lafayette, who came here even before the government of France began to give open aid to the American revolutionaries. Another one of George Washington's principal aides and assistants, the Marquis de Rochambeau. Rochambeau was a French general who came and was one of the chief aides of Washington, especially in the Yorktown campaign. The French Admiral de Grasse, who sealed off the harbor at Chesapeake Bay and cut off the escape of Cornwallis at Yorktown. All of these figures, French, striking a blow against the British and yet at the same time extending help and aid to the other branch, the Manassite branch of the Josephite family. What about the Louisiana Purchase? Are we looking here at an antitypical handing, literally, of the birthright from Reuben to Joseph? An expression in the grandest sense of the fulfillment of 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Napoleon makes an interesting observation at the time which that deal was made. We find in his words, if we look at it through the lens of the identity of Reuben as France and Ephraim and Manasseh as being England and the United States, what better way can you illustrate this ambivalence? His now famous remarks after selling 8.28 million square miles of some of the most fertile real estate in all the world, Napoleon observed, "This accession of territory affirms forever the power of the United States, Manasseh blessed, and I have just given England, the Ephraimite brother, a maritime rival that sooner or later will lay low her pride." Now, the American ambassador who was central in all of this, a man named Livingston, and I'll read that quote for you here as well. Robert Livingston, the U.S. minister in Paris, when signing the final document, said these words, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. From this day, the United States take their place among the powers of first rank." And although it took a while, with the Lewis and Clark expedition and the eventual peopling of that great block of land, eventually that territory, which nearly doubled the United States in terms of its territorial landmass, made the United States into the dominant power and nation that it has become today. Napoleon, on the other hand, used the proceeds, the $15 million or so, which he got out of the deal, to prepare for his war effort against Brother Ephraim across the English Channel. A less dramatic, but nonetheless a relevant example would be that of the French privateer or pirate Jean Lafitte, who operated down in the western area of the Gulf of Mexico. It was Lafitte who provided the American General Andrew Jackson with the cannons, the guns, the powder, the strategic information, all of which helped Andrew Jackson gain the victory in the final battle, the last confrontation of the War of 1812. Now, in my own judgment, the identification of the preponderance of the French population with Reuben is a fairly safe one. Perhaps a little less objective, but nonetheless compelling, is what has been known about the tribal identity of the tribe of Zebulun. And I want you to turn over to Genesis chapter 49 and verse 13. We'll read a couple of translations. Now, remember that Genesis 49 is the prophecy about the sons of Jacob and what will befall them in the last days. Zebulun is predicted to have his dwelling in ships. And many have suggested, and I believe it is a right-headed and accurate identification, that what we're looking at in terms of the tribal identity of the Zebulun tribe is the Dutch people of the modern day. It's the story, if you will, of the Netherlands. And we're going to take the rest of the time today, and perhaps some on into Lecture 16, to see how there are intertwining threads in the story of Joseph, Reuben, and Zebulun in this whole discussion and evolution of Dutch history. As I mentioned, this tape is going to focus perhaps a little more on the history than some of the previous lectures have. And you may want to bear in mind, or maybe even come back and listen to again videotape 15 before you get into some of the things that we'll listen to in terms of part 2 of the lecture series. Who was Zebulun, and what are the evidences of where Zebulun can be found today? Now, there is one volume which I highly recommend, not in all of its dimensions, but it is a very nicely done piece. It is by Helen van Wolderen, and it's entitled The Netherlands, Strange Parallels. Much of what I will present from this point forward relevant to the identity of Zebulun springs out of her work, although there are others who have written extensively about it as well. Zebulun, Genesis 29 and verse 13, a very short reference, but one that's packed with meaning. Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his borders shall be unto Zidon. Now, the interesting thing about this, and you can look in any Bible atlas, and it probably very quickly will validate what I'm about to say. Zebulun, in its tribal boundaries in antiquity, was a landlocked people. Their territory did not extend west to take in the Mediterranean, to give them that outlet to the sea. The modern Dutch translation is interesting as well. It reads, Zebulun shall have his dwellings at the seashore, shall be a haven for a fishing net, and at his flank he shall catch fish. And Van Wolderen and many others have taken this verse and applied it to Dutch history in a way that seems to me to be fairly plausible and convicting. The fishing industry has played a major role in the Dutch economy, particularly fishing for herring. Viewed from another perspective, looking at Zebulun as being a tribe, a people that will be a maritime people by nature. Perhaps this prophecy points as well to the vast Dutch commercial enterprises during the age of exploration, of colonialism, as you get into the 16th and 17th centuries. And indeed, there are 3 locations where that point can be fairly dramatically demonstrated. In the Dutch East Indies, okay, the Hollanders made considerable gain commercially out of their trade going to the Far East and the area now that's known as the East Indies. Remember as well that the Dutch were the first Europeans to set foot on South Africa, where in 1652 they took possession of that famous location, the Cape of Good Hope. Here again, the story becomes intertwined with Reuben as well as Joseph. Louis XIV, one of the longest-lived kings in European history, the King of France, revoked the Charter of Liberties for French Protestants. It was a document which I believe Henry IV, the King of France, had enacted, called the Edict of Nantes. But in 1685, Louis revoked that, saying there was no need for religious freedom, that everyone was Catholic. And that prompted the exodus of multiple thousands of French Huguenots, or if you prefer Huguenots, out of France to North America, to the British Isles, and also to the area of the region, of the Dutch-held region of South Africa. And there's a very strong French element there, even still to this day. Ultimately, the British began to immigrate down into that region. During the Napoleonic Wars, they gained title indeed to South African territory. And in the long run, you find the story of Joseph and Zebulun writ large in the friction and conflict, at least in the initial contact between British and Boers. That is one of the central themes in the early history of the European occupation of the South African area. The Dutch also had an American colony. It was called, appropriately, New Amsterdam. And eventually, in the context of British-Dutch maritime and colonial struggle, that colony would fall into the hands of the British and become known as New York City. Another dimension, which perhaps very well could tie into this particular prophecy, and another, which we'll read now in Deuteronomy 33. Deuteronomy 33, by the way, is in a sense a restatement and an amplification, which oftentimes gives additional and different information of the prophecies we find recorded in Genesis 49. In Deuteronomy 33 and verse 18, let's see, I'm a chapter or two behind. Relevant to Zebulun, we read, and of Zebulun he said, "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out." What of this going out? Moving on down, and also Issachar, who's implied here as well. "They shall call the people unto the mountain, and they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness." And then here is something that is very likely quite relevant to particularly Zebulun or the Dutch. "They shall suck of the abundance of the seas, and the treasures hid in the sand." One of the principal symbols by which Holland is even known still today is that of the windmill. And that's associated by extension with the Reclamation Project, a magnificent engineering marvel in early modern European history, by which water has been pumped out of the Low Countries, as they are called, the land reclaimed and put together to good use. Another sideline to this is the name Zebulun itself. In its various meanings can imply reside, to dwell with, habitation, or interestingly enough, in what could perhaps be an allusion to the dikes of Holland, to enclose. The Dutch as well have had their share in the wealth derived from the North Sea oil fields. Again, going back to this sucking the abundance from the seas. A bibliographical reference which you might at some point want to examine would be one of the members of the Church of God, a longtime writer for many of its publications, John Ross Schrader, who in 1984 in the January Plain Truth magazine wrote a piece called "Why the Dutch Beat Back the Sea." So very fascinating and interesting lines of inquiry spring out of that. Now there's another prophecy which comes from the lips of one of Israel's judges, Deborah by name, and in Judges chapter 5 and verse 14, she describes the nature of that alliance which had come together to rise to the occasion and fight the enemies of Israel, which she and her counterpart Barak did battle with. Out of Ephraim, in verse 14, was there a root taken against Amalek. After you, Benjamin, among your people. Out of Machar, implying, I believe, Manasseh by name, came down the governors. And out of Zebulun, they that handle the pen of the writer. Now, some have taken this, and it may well be true, as a reference pointing to Amsterdam's role as a center for printing and book selling. And in early modern times, certainly that was the case. Others, and Van Wolderen in her book makes some little out of this particular possibility. When you think about the printing press and the impact that it's made on the history of European and world civilization, it was a monumental leap forward in terms of the communication industry. Typically, a German, Johann Gutenberg, receives credit for this invention of movable type, which gave immense possibilities to duplicating the written word. In Holland, there's a different point of view, and many people will point to Lorenz Jazoen Koster of Haarlem in Holland as the one who truly deserves to be credited with this invention of the printing press. Indeed, some would even argue that the technology was stolen from Coster and spirited away and eventually placed in the hands of Johann Gutenberg. Now, examining these lines of argument, let's go back to Genesis chapter 30, because there's an interesting possibility when you consider the birth order of the sons of Jacob. In Genesis 30, we have one of those accounts which presents the arrangement in order of birth of the children of the sons of the patriarch. Verse 20, and Leah said, God has endued me, or given to me, a good dowry. Now with my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called the name of this newborn son Zebulun. If you read down, you'll find that the next male offspring, verse 24, and she, Rachel, called his name Joseph. Joseph was added, as it were, to the family of Jacob's children. Now, in the birth order, Zebulun and Joseph appear 10th and 11th of Jacob's offspring. Probably in the context of that nuclear family being the closest in age to one another, they likely spent a good bit of time together. Is it possible that we see in this relationship a kind of microcosmic account of the modern Anglo-Dutch relationship, that much like brothers in proximity have a love-hate relationship, as no doubt they did in antiquity, that we should look for those kinds of tensions, a kind of sibling rivalry between the two in the story of the modern Dutch and the modern British. And if you look from the 16th and 17th centuries on, indeed, that's remarkably true to form. The Low Countries, as they are called in the literature, the influence on those Low Countries, on the British Isles, has been monumental. Even back as far as the medieval period, the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, as we would know them today, were a critical market for Britain's main medieval export, their main product, wool. Indeed, the French attempt to gain control of those regions, in particular the region of Flanders, was one of the main events which triggered off a conflict that I referred to in an earlier lecture, the first of the 2 100 Years' Wars, this kind of intermittent, protracted conflict between the descendants of the 2 firstborn sons of the patriarch Jacob. That war stretched from 1340 to 1453. For historians, or as they sometimes say, close enough for government work, it's 100 years roundabout. In AD 1300, the figures that we have on the British export market, 2/3 of Britain's exports came from raw wool, a remarkable volume going out. And what went on in those Low Countries, if the Low Countries happened to be seized or controlled by an adversarial kingdom or power, that spelled economic trouble, and England was very concerned about who was in charge in that region and what they were doing. The late 17th century, Britain was given a monarch from the Low Countries. William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, who was the chief political official in the more or less republican configuration that existed in Holland at that time. William, by his connection through a Stuart princess, Mary by name, if memory serves me right, Mary, the daughter of the first marriage of James II, who had to flee England for his life because of his Roman Catholic leanings and his unpopularity in England as king. William of Orange was invited to come and take the English throne, and indeed he did. It was a marvelous opportunity from his point of view. William was a bitter enemy of Louis XIV, the King of France, and here again this intertwining of Zebulun, Joseph, and Reuben we begin to see, and we'll look at it in greater detail in part 2. But for now, just to summarize and illustrate, William and Louis were bitter enemies, and William had to fight for his life against French armies from time to time throughout his political career. The opportunity to become King of England opened up a storehouse of resources to supply his battles against Louis and France, and indeed it opened the opportunity to broaden the scope of that confrontation. William was the chief architect of an English-Dutch-Austrian Grand Alliance against the French. Louis, of course, hated the Dutch and all that they represented, middle-class values, religious toleration, and political independence in a day of absolute divine right monarchy. But here again, William's initiation of a war which spanned from 1689 to 1815, and sometimes called by British historians the Second 100 Years' War. It initiated this period which will reach high pitch and crescendo by the late 1700s and the early 1800s, the precise time when that release of the birthright blessing is about to be given to the descendants of Joseph. Another name which is worth placing focus on, at least momentarily. In England, the Low Countries were even called the cockpit, the driver's seat, perhaps by a more modern name, the cockpit of Europe. And from the Battle of Crécy in 1346 as part of the 100 Years' War, First 100 Years' War, to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which finally drew closure to the Second 100 Years' War. A long succession of the most pivotal battles determining the fate of England occurred in precisely this region of those Low Countries. William Pitt the Younger, who was Prime Minister from 1804 to 1806, was fond of describing Belgium, part of the region of these Low Countries, as, quote, the chain which unites England to the continent. He also made the observation that the nation which holds control of the Low Countries, quote, holds a pistol pointed at the heart of England. And it's no great surprise. In those days, in days before and in days after, as when the German army of Kaiser Wilhelm came across violating neutrality in the territory of Belgium, defense of those Low Countries has been a priority in British foreign policy from the earliest of times. Partly because of that, then, we see in this broader story a prominent thread of brotherly cooperation within the confines of the 16th century. You have a variety of interesting ventures among brothers, efforts to help one another, to resist common enemies, and to contribute to the advancement in mutually beneficial ways of both peoples. One of the most prominent of these stories really begins around the mid-16th century and kind of reaches crescendo and climax with the episode that we'll talk about in a moment or two of the Spanish Armada in 1588. In the 16th century, the English sea dogs, which bore a very strong resemblance to just outright pirates, who oftentimes operated with the covert approval and sanction of the government of the day, Elizabeth I being a prime example. The English sea dogs cooperated with the Dutch sea beggars, and they typically challenged the dominant force and power in European politics of the day, the Spanish Empire, which was ruled by Philip II. Philip was king, or his dates, that is, run 1527 to 1598. Now, around the midpoint in the 16th century, in 1566, the Netherlands, which was controlled by the Spanish Habsburg political edifice ruled by Philip II, the people of the Netherlands, principally in the northern regions especially, enacted a nationalist religious reaction, a revolt of the Netherlands, as it's called in the textbooks, against Spanish Habsburg domination. Dutch Calvinist resistance prompted a vengeful and a violent Spanish retaliation. Various military men were dispatched to put down the revolt, to subdue the people, and to punish the ones who were guilty. The Duke of Alva, whose administration ran from 1567 to 1573, implemented what is probably well described by historians as a reign of terror. 10,000 Spanish regulars were dispatched to the Low Countries, and Alva boasted up to 18,000 political and religious executions of various dissidents and the like. Now, in the midst of all of the turmoil in the Low Countries, England obviously watched with a self-interest at what was going on. England, namely Elizabeth I, who reigned her country from 1558 to 1603, England received frequent appeals for aid from the Hollanders across the English Channel. And initially, as was typical of her foreign policy style, she dispatched that aid in a covert fashion. In 1585, the Duke of Parma, now the man responsible for administering Spanish rule in that region, sacked the prominent city of Antwerp in the area of Holland. And this raised fears through all the Protestant kingdoms and lands in Europe that there may well be Catholic domination over the whole of the Netherlands. As a result, in August, on the 20th, in the year 1585, Elizabeth authorized the Treaty of Nonsuch, and thereafter England rendered an open aid to these Dutch rebels fighting Spanish Catholic imperialism. It was at that juncture, from 1585 to 1587, that Elizabeth sent some 2,000 British troops to directly and openly aid the Dutch rebels, plus paying in the neighborhood of £250,000 in financial assistance. Now, this particular juncture might be a good place to interject a certain vignette relevant to church history. And once again, these things I think we've learned in the Church of God in recent years. We need to take care in dogmatizing. We need not to beat people over the head with prophetic speculation. But the possibilities here are fascinating, and they're worth taking a few minutes of our time in this lecture to explore and examine. The Treaty of Nonsuch came precisely 1,260 years after the notorious ecumenical council, the first of its kind, at Nicaea in AD 325. Now, some have suggested that this began the period prophetically alluded to in Revelation chapter 12. Let's turn there in verse 6. John speaks about a time for the church in the wilderness. Revelation 12 and verse 6, the woman, the church, fled into the wilderness where she had a place and a sense of protection prepared by God for her, and that she should be fed there 1,260 days. And as when we get to Unit 7, we'll talk about the principle of a day for a year. In prophecy, when a day is mentioned, it often symbolically represents a length of time comprising 1 year. Now, at Nicaea, the Quattrodeciman controversy was the second big order of business. The first and primary was the nature of God and the distinction between Jesus Christ and God the Father, and issues relevant to that and what the Holy Spirit was and such. The second order of business dealt with the date on which the Passover should be held. The council at Nicaea eventually ruled that no one should be allowed to observe the Jewish Passover on Nisan 14. It was forbidden from that point forward. Interestingly, it fell between two other decrees, both of which bode quite ill for any Christian who believed in the responsibility, the obligation of observing the seventh-day Sabbath. An edict in 321 AD forbid work to be done on Sunday, a kind of Sabbath principle applied to the first day of the week. Then, about 40 years after Nicaea, 39 to be exact, at the council, another ecumenical gathering, the Council of Laodicea, in 364, Sabbath keeping was officially declared illegal for anyone who called himself a Christian. The net effect of all of these developments, centering around the time, of course, of the Nicene Council in 325, was to begin to drive true Christians who really believed in the need to obey the Bible. They began to be driven underground. Now, if that be the case, we should expect to find some deeply significant development around the late 16th century, which would ultimately enable Christians to emerge from the wilderness, not a literal wilderness, but practicing their Christianity in seclusion or in hiding. they could now emerge into an increasingly tolerant religious environment. As I think we'll see, that is precisely what begins to unfold in the late 16th century. In addition to the Treaty of Nonsuch, shortly thereafter came the execution of Elizabeth's cousin, and one who had been the object of untold plots to dislodge and remove Elizabeth and install Mary, Queen of Scots, a cousin of Elizabeth's, on the English throne. In 1587, Elizabeth finally was presented with evidence that simply couldn't be denied. It was incontrovertible. And she realized that she was going to have to address the issue. She had put it off for quite some time. It was bad business for one monarch to execute another monarch, in this case, a woman who had been formerly Queen of Scotland. What was good today for her might become good tomorrow for Elizabeth. But ultimately, her advisors prevailed upon her judgment, and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, did take place, thereby ending Philip II's last flagging hope of maybe being able to eventually regain control of the British Isles. Because you see, for a period of time, Philip II was actually married to Queen Mary I, perhaps better known to most of us as Bloody Mary. He married Elizabeth's half-sister, the product of the union between King Henry VIII and the princess which came from the kingdom of Spain. Once Mary was eliminated, very quickly thereafter, Philip began to mobilize for a military strike against his English adversary. The precipitating factor in dispatching that ill-fated Spanish Armada in 1588 was, in fact, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now let's take a moment and talk about this Spanish Armada vignette. Spain was the most formidable military power of the 16th century, much like the United States has been in the latter half of the present century. Philip put together an invincible armada, as it was known. It was invincible in the same sense that Jericho and Jerusalem were impregnable before Joshua and David, respectively. The Armada was the largest naval force that had ever been assembled to date in modern times. It had 130 ships. It carried about 31,000 men, most of whom were soldiers, the idea being that the ships would put into port on the continent, be ferried across the English Channel, and make a land invasion, something which had not successfully been done since 1066, and William the Conqueror had done it. But these 31,000 men, along with 2,431 cannons, all were headed for England to bring down the throne of Queen Elizabeth, that Protestant and illegitimate queen, as the Catholic Church portrayed her. Now, the Armada had a 2-to-1 advantage numerically over the English fleet. But from the very onset, the whole enterprise was fraught with misfortune. Not long before the Armada was launched, the greatest Spanish admiral of the 16th century, Alvaro Bazan, died of typhus. His replacement could hardly have been less likely. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was a melancholy and a reluctant man. He lacked experience at military command. His social credentials provided him very little help in terms of leading the military force. He was in declining health, he didn't want the job, and of all things, he was prone to becoming seasick. The Armada, nonetheless, under his charge, left. They dropped anchor ultimately at the port city of Calais, across the English Channel from the British Isles. They landed, put down to anchor, and on July 31st, 1588, the English fleet under the command of Admiral Howard, but under the rather dashing direction of people like Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins and Frobisher and many others whose names stand prominent in the annals of British naval history. They sent fire ships, launching them into those Spanish ships at anchor in port. And of course, the Spanish sailors did precisely what they'd been commanded not to do. Don't cut anchor. When they saw the fire ships, in a panic-stricken sense which almost bears resemblance to the kind of events you read about in the book of Bible in terms of Gideon and the Midianites. They cut anchor, began to run about in panic, took off, set sail to be pursued and vigorously pounded by the smaller English fleet, but the fleet that was, in terms of size, smaller, yes, but quite more maneuverable. Those English ships hotly pursued their Spanish enemies and pounded them all along the way as the Spanish Armada fled up the northern English eastern coastline. Ultimately, and again, many have taken in this a sign of providence, the fact that God wanted the outcome to unfold in a particular way. The English ran out of ammunition, but as the fleeing Spanish ships continued their northern flight, gale force winds came up and hammered the Armada as well as it sailed north, first around Scotland and then eventually past Northern Ireland. Many have looked at this and been reminded of Psalm 48 and verse 7. You break the ships of Tarshish with an eastern wind. Again in Psalm 107. Psalm 107 verse 23. Let me go to 107 and it'll say here what I want. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and the wonders in the deep. For he commands and raises the stormy wind which lifted up the waves thereof. Then again in verse 29, it is that same God who makes a storm calm so that the waves thereof are still. 160 ships out of the original fleet, a paltry number, were able to make it back, limping back into the Spanish harbor. 10,000 soldiers out of the original armada returned. England lost only 200 men in battle in a 10-day period of action. We'll bring closure to this now, and when we come back next time, we'll take a look once again at this issue as to where and whether and to what degree might God have been involved in this decisive landmark turning point in the history of Spain and England and really all the people of northwestern Europe.